local Lay Dominicans, we'll be discussing some of the gems we've discovered in our studium, where we share the fruits of our contemplation and the joy of the gospel message. Representing our St. Albert the Great Lay Dominican chapter and co-hosts of today's show are myself, Cheryl Drozda,
and Jeff Drozda. And today we have a special guest in studio today, and it is Father Joshua Guillory, who is pastor of St. Patrick Church here in Lafayette. And some people might say, well, why is Father Guillory in the studio with us today? Well, he is our religious advisor. He is the religious advisor for our Third Order Lay Dominican chapter, St. Albert the Great chapter here in Lafayette, based out of Our Lady of Wisdom Church. And so when we began first of all, it was a group and then became a chapter, we are required to have a religious assistant. And so we worked. We looked far and wide, high and low, and of course Father Guillory, who did I don't want to say did some time, but spent some time at the Angelicum in Rome, and did some wonderful things in terms of just his unique experience in Rome. And so, for those of you who don't know, Father Guillory is fluent in French, Italian, Latin. Did I miss anything, Father?
English.
Oh, I wasn't sure about that.
I also speak English.
And that's good. But so the interesting part is that, during his time in Rome, studied canon law, and back and forth in Rome, you did, 2 tours of duty in Rome?
I was in Rome 3 separate times.
3 separate times. And quite frankly, the last time from 2013 to 2019 is the most interesting because he was official at the Supreme Tribunal of the Apostolic Signatura in Rome. Father, what is that?
Well, the Supreme Tribunal of the Apostolic Signatura is one of the dicasteries in the Roman Curia. It's in the service of the Holy Father and the Universal Church. And it is essentially the Church's Supreme Court. So it is the final place where controversies go to be resolved. Many controversies that arise in the Church, and here we're not talking about marriage nullity cases. There's a whole other entity that deals with that, and that's the Roman Rota. But all the other controversies that are in the Church end up going to the Apostolic Signatura. They make their way up through the other dicasteries, through what we call an administrative review, and finally the Signatura guarantees a judicial review of those administrative processes. So it is the final word that resolves those issues. The area that I worked in mostly in the Signatura was the Signatura's competency as supervision over all tribunals in the world. So all the local tribunals throughout the world have to submit annual reports to the Signatura, and we review those, and we cooperate with the local bishops to ensure the correct administration of justice.
So when you talk about a controversy, what give just a generic example of what that might be? Sure.
One of the most common controversies is the closing of parish churches. And we see that a lot. We're not seeing that here in South Louisiana very much, but in other places in the country. Many churches were built close to each other in downtown areas, and populations have shifted, and bishops have had to make hard decisions about closing down certain churches. When that happens, when you're going to merge a parish, inevitably there are some people there they're not pleased with the decision. And so the church law guarantees that the faithful can have recourse against the decisions of their bishops. And so those recourses make their way up, and it's controversies like that that are resolved by the different dicasteries in the Roman Curia through what we call an administrative review, and then finally at the Signatura with a judicial review, which is a fuller guarantee of rights of parties and defense and representation.
So you are a canon lawyer?
I am a canon lawyer, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
That sounds pretty impressive to me.
He's also our pastor, and I say homilist extraordinaire. It's some of the best homilies ever, and everybody who goes there knows that. So one of the reasons why we had asked if he would be our religious assistant is also because of his background in the Dominican education. And so the Angelicum that was one reason why we knew that he was prepared for dealing with us Dominicans. So
also known as the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas. So there obviously is some lengthy, interesting history there. Can you educate us a little bit about that?
About the
Angelicum.
About the Angelicum, yeah. So the Angelicum, I said earlier, I went to Rome on 3 separate occasions, and we talked a little bit about the third occasion when I worked in the Roman Curia. But when I first went over to Rome was in the year 2003. And for 3 years I studied at the Angelicum, so at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, and that's where I did my theology undergraduate work. And the seminarians who were sent to Rome to study, we all lived together at the North American College. The university system or seminary system in Rome is different than in other places, because the college is simply a place where you live. It's a collegium, so a place where you live together in common. And then for our theological formation, we have to go out into the different pontifical universities that are in the city of Rome. And typically the choice was between the Pontifical Gregorian University, which is run by the Jesuits, and the Angelicum, which is run by the Dominicans. And so one of the advantages of studying at the Angelicum, at least for seminarians in that time, was that the Angelicum has a theology course in first cycle that's both in English and in Italian. So you have the whole difficulty of going to Rome and trying to master the Italian language, and then beginning your studies in Italian almost right away when you have only a rudimentary knowledge of the language. One of the advantages of going to the Angelicum was you're able to leap right in, keep learning your Italian, but you're taking all your coursework in English, at least in that first cycle. And so immediately you can get into the material. Now the Angelicum is, I think, a very special place. It's been there for a few centuries. The Dominican presence in Rome began around in the early 1200s, and there was a Dominican college there at Santa Maria sopra Minerva. It was the first Dominican college, and a Dominican house of studies back in the 13th century. Over the centuries, the Angelicum took different shapes and different forms and came to be a pontifical university. And so it's staffed by Dominican friars predominantly from all over the world. And that was one of the great advantages, I think, as well, of studying with the Dominicans at the Angelicum, was the worldwide representation of professors. So we had Dominican priests and a few nuns, Dominican sisters too. I mean, let's think, from Chile and Peru and the United States and Canada, from New Zealand, Australia, Japan, India, Malta, Spain, Poland, Croatia, the list goes. I mean, almost every country. At one point, I remember, I think we had tallied it up, professors from 30 different countries, all Dominican friars or all Dominican sisters, who had taught us in just the course of 3 or 4 years.
So we had one of our Dominican members ask me to ask you about the advantages of being there, which you've already addressed some of them, but I would say that just that exposure to all the different cultures, the Catholic environment being universal, would be a great way to help priests to be better pastors, even back in where you're going to meet a lot of people from diverse places, even in our own diocese.
Sure, this is one of the advantages of being sent to study theology in Rome, is one immediately has an everyday built-in sense of the Catholicity of the Church, the universality of the Church, because people from all continents, Catholics from all continents, come to the city of Rome as the central point, the unifying point of our faith, in union with the Holy Father and all that Rome has to offer. So yeah, that is a tremendous advantage of being able to study in Rome.
Now, my understanding is that the papal theologian, or the papal household theologian, if I'm not mistaken, has always been a Dominican. Is that true or no?
Yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm. So the house, Saint Dominic and Saint Francis are spiritual brothers, as it were, and the two orders complement one another. And so, yeah, the theologian for the papal household has been a Dominican for many centuries, whereas the preacher for the papal household is a Franciscan friar. And so you sort of, it's just an interesting way that turned out. That's part of that, some competition between the two orders, but I think a healthy brotherly competition. But speaking of that particular person right now, Father Giertych, who is a Dominican friar he grew up in Poland, or his family's Polish, but he grew up in England. But he was one of our professors at the Angelicum, a professor of moral theology. And the way that he taught that introductory course to moral theology in the Thomist tradition, so focusing on the virtues and looking at the life of virtue and the life of holiness, and it was that optic through which moral theology is taught. I remember what a life-changing experience that was, just sitting in that classroom day after day taking notes, and every student in that class was completely rapt Father Giertych would lecture almost breathlessly, for the entire period, and we were scribbling notes furiously. And it was a common experience among all of us who were in that course that this was something that wasn't only touching our minds, but making our hearts burn. And I think that's also the great joy of the Dominican tradition, especially in moral theology, that we're not so much focusing on the do's and don'ts, but we're looking at the virtues and the vices, and then how to grow in virtue, that is to say, in power, by the Holy Spirit, moving us forward to do great things and to glorify God with our lives. A transformative experience, truly.
I'm kind of jealous, but if I'm not mistaken, I think, now I don't know if it was the case when you were there, but the laity can also take classes there. Was
Sure.
that the case when you were there as well?
Oh, absolutely. So there are lay people who come, who take courses there, religious women, men from all the continents. That is also a unique, I suppose, aspect of studying Rome, is that the universities are open to anyone who's interested. And so as you're sitting in the university courses in Rome, you're there with men studying for the priesthood, you're there with consecrated religious, you're there with lay people, and we're all seeking to learn the faith. And yeah.
So in terms of, let's talk about some Dominican saints. Obviously, there are a whole plethora of Dominican saints that exist out there. What are some of your favorites?
Well, one of my favorites is the founder, St. Dominic himself, to found the Order of Preachers, the whole charism of the Dominican order to study the faith in order to share it with others through preaching. Cheryl was paying me a very nice compliment, I'm sure it's undeserved, about my preaching at St. Patrick's, but I enjoy preaching so much, and that was always a draw for me. And so to align myself, I guess, just spiritually and look at, the spiritual household that the Dominican order is, for me, that was always a draw, to know that these men and women were dedicated to spreading the gospel, to preaching the good news with intelligence, with joy, and in the power of the Holy Spirit. And so that St. Dominic, for sure, is a real favorite of mine. And what person who's ever encountered St. Thomas Aquinas can't, fall in love with St. Thomas Aquinas? And maybe that's not so obvious when people read St. Thomas Aquinas, but I remember many years ago when I had one of my first introductions to St. Thomas Aquinas. It was in a little book called The Summa of the Summa, which Professor Peter Kreft had sort of edited the Summa and whittled it down to very manageable, just the most interesting parts. In any event, in the introductory material there, he has a quote from Flannery O'Connor, from her Habit of Being, her letters and notes, where she recalls a moment of her childhood. She says she would read the Summa incessantly, even as a child, and her mother would come into her room and she'd be sitting in bed holding the Summa, and her mother would say, Flannery, it's time to go to bed, turn out the lights. And she had some little quip like, yes, mother, but I say to you that the light is not extinguished, it simply ceases to shine, or something. She was channeling her inner St. Thomas. But then she closes that, she says, I can't help but love St. Thomas, because it's so obvious that St. Thomas loves God.
Wow.
And so even though people find, St. Thomas's writings very dry, almost impersonal, just this very precision that he has, that can be off-putting to people, but behind it there is a tremendous passion, because you don't put together a work like the Summa, the intellectual rigor, the hard, long hours that must have gone into that, without being driven by a passionate love for God. There was Flannery O'Connor who said that, I can't help but love St. Thomas, because it's so obvious that he loves God.
Wow.
Great. Well, you are listening to Catholic Radio for Acadiana, 90.5 FM and 99.5 FM. We are your local Lay Dominicans here in Lafayette, Louisiana, and we are based out of Our Lady of Wisdom Church. And want to thank Stein Lumber for their sponsorship, so we can bring you the fruits of our contemplation from the studium to the studio, and that's what we're doing here today. But today we have a special guest, Father Joshua Guillory, who is pastor at St. Patrick Church here in Lafayette. And those of you interested in joining us at 7:30 Mass every morning during the week, please feel free to join us. But right now we're talking about the Summa and St. Thomas. The interesting thing is that, the Summa, throughout the course of probably centuries, has always been a staple of theology and the church. But people today kind of say, well, how does the Summa impact the church and me today? How would you respond to even Catholics today that are saying, why do I need to read the Summa, and why is the Summa important to the church?
Yeah, the Summa has become a real touchstone, and it was Pope Leo XIII who sort of brought the Summa forth as a kind of the touchstone for Catholic teaching. St. Thomas, when he wrote the Summa, he meant it, and I can't imagine he didn't mean it with some sense of irony, but he meant it as a sort of a manual for beginners. I don't know what a master's manual would look like if the Summa is a manual for beginners, but it's meant to be a summary of Catholic thought and theology. And there were many Summas written in the time. St. Thomas is not the only one. I mean, this was the mode of doing theology at the period, and so the great theologians of the period, we have their Summas, but St. Thomas is the one that's most outstanding for his integration of the new thought that was coming to the church in the 1200s of the philosopher Aristotle, encountering the fathers of the church and his deep reading of the fathers, and his scriptural reading too. I mean, all these things go together. St. Thomas's Summa is profoundly based in the scriptures and in the church fathers, with an encounter with Aristotelian thought and categories. So it becomes a philosophical, theological work of great importance that really is the capstone theological work of that era. And in the centuries that have come afterwards, the Summa is read, it is studied because of that great status, and it hasn't been surpassed yet. There's no one who does theology in the church that you can't ignore St. Thomas Aquinas, and you can't ignore the Summa, because it is really a summary, a concise summary of all Christian doctrine. St. Thomas wasn't perfect, and not all his conclusions are perfect, but none of ours will be on this side of heaven. However, the Church still recommends the Summa for instance, for all priests who are studying for the priesthood. It's a requirement that there be some encounter with the thought and the work of St. Thomas Aquinas, and in subsequent centuries, you can't do theology without reckoning with St. Thomas Aquinas. Even those who don't really care for St. Thomas Aquinas or trying to do a new type of theology, nothing wrong with that, they'll have to reckon with him and take his thoughts into consideration.
A few years ago, I did read through the Summa. It was the passion to know God more, to experience Him more. And what I found, even though I'm sure I didn't get 100%, I did what Adler says, I've said this before, is just, go, if I get 40% out of it, that's 40% that I wouldn't have gotten if I didn't read through the Summa. So it took me a couple years, but I felt like it was not just his thoughts, but like you said, that he integrated so many other saints, and like St. Isidore's etymology. I love that. I mean, every time you brought that in, St. Augustine comes in. It's like a party of saints talking together. I just really enjoyed it. So I'd encourage people to get over that.
That's a great way of putting it, because you do have to for the everyday Catholic to read the Summa, it can be a little daunting because the structure, we're not used to it. It comes out of that disputational model in the Middle Ages. So let's have a debate, but a very structured debate, not the kind of craziness you see nowadays on social media or YouTube. But these were very well-organized debates about people who loved God and were seeking the truth. And so they would debate, and by debating in that adversarial manner, they would arrive at a greater truth. They would refine the truth. And so we're not used to that so much. So it takes a little while to get into it. But I love the way you put it, Cheryl, that you start reading what St. Thomas is saying, and it's a party of all the great saints, because he's bringing up the church fathers. I mean, he had read all this stuff. It's amazing. His knowledge of Scripture, when he quotes the Scriptures too, bringing all that in there, it's really quite wonderful. You see, he's not just a dry intellect. He's a man who's read deeply, thought deeply, and obviously loved deeply too.
And also, so one other thing I wanted to go back to was when we were talking about your homilies, I almost recognized the structure from way back when we had a priest who was Dominican, St. Dominic.
Father Dominic.
Father Dominic.
Father Dominic.
Yeah, that's. I'm sorry about that. I'm sure he's going to be a saint too. and I wondered if did you learn a lot about like homiletics in a Dominican style? Is that possible, or is that not really a thing?
Oh no, I think that's very possible. I had one of my best friends in the seminary is a priest of Birmingham, Alabama, and he and I we'd sit next to each other in class and study together. And so studying St. Thomas Aquinas and preparing for the exams, you have to do all the distinctions, because the one who distinguishes well teaches well. And so St. Thomas makes many distinctions, which can be intellectually very stimulating, but it can also be a little tedious too, And so we would laugh about all these tedious Thomistic distinctions that we had to study and learn for in preparing for the exams. However, a few years after we had been ordained priests, probably 3 years or so, he and I met up and had a visit, and we were reminiscing and said, all those tedious Thomistic distinctions? He said, I use those in my homilies all the time. And to great effect. He's like, people appreciate when you make these distinctions, and they think you're the smartest man ever because you've come up with them. And he said, I'm just cribbing from St. Thomas. And it's affecting my preaching and the way that we structure the message, the way that we're thinking about, the scriptures or the message that we have to proclaim. The Dominican habit, intellectual habit, that is, certainly rubs off on you.
Some people talk about a Dominican spirituality. I'm assuming that being around so many Dominicans in Rome, you were exposed to a little bit of that. And whether it's spiritual direction, whether it was just interaction outside the classroom, but for our listeners, what would you say defines Dominican spirituality?
Well, I'm sure there are many takes on what is Dominican spirituality. I can only speak to what my experience, among those Dominican friars and those professors was veritas. There was a search for truth, and not veritas as a weapon or something to bludgeon people with or the world with, but veritas is that which sets us free. And so what I saw among the Dominican friars who were there, many of whom lived there in the convent at the Angelicum, because the Angelicum's university, but it's also a convent of Dominican friars who live in the upstairs quarters. What we saw was, in the search for veritas, in the search for truth, there was a real sense of peace and joy that surrounded. So I would imagine that the Dominican friars there at the Angelicum were, in their interactions with us students, were sharing with us the fruits of their own spiritual life and their own charism and even their own living together. So men from all these different continents coming together, and that great joy of seeking truth and then of handing it on to others. And so the Angelicum, I would say, distinctively, even among the other pontifical universities, was really a place of prayer and contemplation. Uniquely at that time, there was a Eucharistic chapel with exposition of the Blessed Sacrament where we students could go in and out, and the professors too would come in and out. So you had there, in the very small footprint that the Angelicum is, because it's not a very big building it's not a very big complex at all. So you had the chapel, you had the classrooms, you had the Dominican convent, and it was all together. And so prayer and study, contemplation and truth were all they were there. They were lived and breathed. And even in our interactions with the professors between classes or after classes, was one of sharing this great joy of the gospel and what we're doing in a spirit of St. Thomas. I mean, I remember very well after classes sometimes when we had a break, there was a little courtyard just outside of the Angelicum, part of the Angelicum, fenced in, and it was full of orange trees, which is a hallmark Dominican tradition that comes from Spain. The Spaniard Dominicans, when they came to Rome, brought with them their citrus trees, their orange trees, and planted them everywhere. So when you go to Rome and you have a Dominican site, there'll probably be orange trees around.
I did not know that.
And that's a Spanish connection for the Dominican order.
Cool.
But we would walk around this courtyard with our professors, just talking about what they had just spoken about in theology. And so there was a real notion that here we are as wayfarers. That's something that's very dear to St. Thomas, the viator, the wayfarer as he makes his way through this life. And we're doing that in the company of these friars who have given their lives to live the spirit of St. Dominic. And like I said, for me, it was a spirit of truth and all that comes from truth, which is peace and joy. That's what I saw about the Dominican spirit.
Now I'm jealous too of it. And that is what our Lay Dominican chapter is about. Like when you're excited about your faith, and you want to share it with other people, and that excites you as well. I mean, it's like you can't just keep it in. And so there was this, for me anyway, search for a community where there was an outlet for that, where we could share the excitement of our faith. Study is another charism of the Dominicans, so study some of the same things, but then pray about it, and then come and share that excitement of what we've all discovered, which is always something different for everybody that we get out of whether we're reading the Summa or other readings. So is there anything else about the Angelicum that you remember that you want to share, or thoughts about the Dominicans?
No, I touched upon those, those major things, but it was the Dominican, the Angelicum, as one of the pontifical universities, Rome, is certainly one of the smaller ones. So the numbers of students are many fewer than if you go to some of the other bigger pontifical universities, which means we get to know our professors a little bit. And so there was a a greater intimacy. The professors got to know your name, you got to know their names, and we got to see the quirks and the little idiosyncrasies of our professors, which is always great fun as students because we get to tease them and come up with clever nicknames for them, but also grow in appreciation for, what these men and women have dedicated their lives to and done so, it seems so joyfully. I have to say the Angelicum was really a place of joy that I think the students, at least at my time in Rome, who didn't go to the Angelicum were also jealous of, because their universities weren't always filled with that spirit of camaraderie and joy to the degree that the Angelicum was and is today.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
What you had mentioned that Pope St. John Paul had also taught there. Did you say that?
No, I hadn't mentioned that, but that's worth mentioning. Yeah, the Angelicum does have some...
I heard you say it before.
That's right. That's right. But St. John Paul II studied at the Angelicum and did his doctoral work at the Angelicum. So he's certainly one of the more illustrious alumni, at least in recent times, of that university.
So, Father, it's my understanding that you're going to be going back to Rome next year, I think June.
Yeah, next June.
Tell us a little bit about that.
So I have these pesky parishioners who decided to organize a trip to Rome. Their names are Jeff and Cheryl Drozda. So it was a wonderful opportunity, I think, whenever y'all decided you wanted to do this, and you invited me to think about going. And by the time we go, it will be 5 years that I've been away from Rome, which is the longest I've been away from Rome since the first time I went there in the year 2000.
I believe you said you were Rome sick.
Yes, I'm getting a little Rome sick. For all those years that I lived in Rome, especially my last time there, I was homesick all the time, always wanted to come back home. But yeah, now the Rome sickness is coming back, and I'm very eager to go back. And as we go back, we're going to be visiting the city, I think at a great time of year before it gets too hot and before there are too many crazy crowds. But we'll be hitting a lot of the Dominican hot spots in the city, Santa Sabina and Santa Maria sopra Minerva and the Angelicum. So that'll be I think a great Rome coming for me, and for those who haven't been yet, it'll be a great experience.
And for those who might be interested in going, we'll put in a little plug for Magnificat Travel, who is organizing everything for us. So if you're interested, feel free to reach out to Magnificat Travel, or maybe even call St. Patrick Church, and we can direct you to the right information to see if you might be interested in joining us in June of 2024.
Well, I noticed today that in your homily you mentioned things that, how is God working in your life? How do you think that God is working in your life in shepherding our Lay Dominican chapter?
So this is a question, that I posed in this morning's homilies. When we cut through all the kind of superficial chit chat and the small talk that we're so accustomed to, and we ask ourselves, or we ask someone else, how is God working in my life? Yeah, the opportunities that the Lord sends us priests, or everyone, but speaking myself as a priest, to take on different ministries, to work with different groups, is, I think, the work of the Holy Spirit, and it's something that we have to discern carefully, given all of our commitments. But my invitation by your group to accompany you has been, I think, a blessed thing. It's kind of reconnected me to my Dominican roots in my studies, and it's very... I think it's very heartening to see a group of local lay people forming around the spirit of St. Dominic and the spirit of the Dominican order, dedicating themselves to study, to contemplation, to prayer, and to evangelizing. And that's, to hand over to others the fruits of our contemplation. That's the great gift. And so it's been a great gift for me to work with all of you so far, and I look forward to doing it in the future.
Well, we appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yes, thanks for all you do. Just as a pastor and our spiritual Dominican leader, we greatly appreciate that, and hopefully we'll have you back if you're willing to come back. And this concludes our show for today. So we'll turn it over to the Hillbilly Thomist, and everyone, God bless.
See you next week.
Lived through time, passed through fire, broke my heart, wounded desire, changed my life, fixed the past, stared at death and it stared back, standing fast in the light of the word. A shotgun blast was the last thing I heard. I rattled in the wind like a window pane. My soul's alright, but my body...